Hey guys, tonight we step down into cool brick shadows beneath an ancient Sumerian temple where dust clings to your sandals, oil lamps breathe a soft amber glow, and a line of clay tablets seems to whisper that something was placed deep underground on purpose. Some parts of tonight's journey are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? Because the evidence we have might be clear in one place and faint in another. Historians debate details, archaeology suggests patterns, and a few old words could mean more than they first appear. You probably won't survive this if you expect a neat answer in the first 5 minutes, because ancient Mesopotamia is generous with puzzles and absolutely rude about footnotes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, post your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in your imagination at least on a mound of old mud brick and memory in southern Mesopotamia, where the land between the Tigris and Euphrates once held some of the world's earliest cities. Most historians agree that Sumerian temple sites were not built once and left alone. They were repaired, rebuilt, raised, layered and raised again, one generation stacking its sacred brickwork on top of the weathered labour of another. The evidence we do have points to long sequences of construction, and archaeology suggests those layers mattered not just as engineering, but as ritual continuity. So you picture workers carrying baskets of earth, mixing mud with straw pressing bricks, smoothing plaster, and trying not to complain too loudly in front of the temple officials. It is a calm scene until you remember this is also administration taxes, offerings, schedules, and the ancient equivalent of someone asking if you submitted the form correctly. Civilization begins, and almost immediately paperwork appears. What's broadly accepted is that temples in Sumer were more than places to pray. They were economic centres, storage hubs, employers and symbols of civic identity. Grain passed through them, wool passed through them, oil, beer, labour records, offerings and obligations passed through them. If you want to understand why a buried chamber matters in a story like this, you start here with the ordinary world of brick grain and accounting. Because sometimes the strangest clue hides in a setting that is almost painfully practical. And that is where your attention drifts downward. Beneath visible floors, beneath rebuilt walls, beneath later repairs, there could be earlier surfaces, foundation fills, and in some cases, carefully placed deposits. Most historians agree that ancient builders across Mesopotamia and neighbouring regions sometimes placed objects beneath important buildings. Archaeology suggests these deposits might include tools, figurines, inscribed items or symbolic materials connected to dedication and protection. The mainstream anchor is simple and solid. People built sacred structures and they sometimes buried meaningful things under them. One interpretation is that these buried deposits were messages not to us exactly, but to God's future builders or the structure itself. A careful reading might suggest that placing something below ground could carry both ritual and practical meanings at once. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now you begin to see the shape of tonight's puzzle. A popular rumour claims that Sumerian texts reveal the Anunnaki planted something deep underground in a way that sounds dramatic, almost cinematic, like a scene designed for a thumbnail, with glowing symbols and a suspiciously well-lit tunnel. This theory isn't widely accepted, but the phrase itself is interesting, because it points us toward a real question hiding inside the hype. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if planted is not treasure in the pirate sense, not a secret weapon, not a magic crystal with excellent marketing, but something tied to ritual memory, survival, or symbolic continuity? That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. As you move through this imagined temple interior, you notice details that keep the mood grounded. The smell is dust, clay, old reed matting, lamp oil, and faint bitumen from repaired masonry. Your fingers brush a wall and come away gritty. Somewhere in the courtyard above, someone is tallying grain rations on a tablet, while another person argues about deliveries, which is oddly comforting because even in deep antiquity, somebody is still chasing inventory. Human continuity right there. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented, we can say temples were layered and rebuilt. Documented, we can say Sumerian cities maintained complex administrative systems. Documented, we can say cuneiform tablets recorded practical transactions alongside literary and ritual texts. Interpreted, we may wonder whether a phrase about placing or planting below ground refers to a symbolic deposit, a stored reserve, or a ritual act. Imagined, we can sit in the cool darkness and ask what it felt like for a temple community to place something precious beneath a floor and trust time to keep it. Historians still argue whether some buried objects under Mesopotamian structures were primarily protective rituals, commemorative acts, or practical inclusions that later gained symbolic meaning. That debate matters because it keeps us honest. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The debate does not kill the mystery. It gives the mystery a frame so it does not float away and pretend to be certainty. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And one clue, in the broadest sense, is the repeated ancient habit of burying significance under architecture. If you are a temple builder or priestly administrator in a city where floods, repairs, and political shifts can rewrite the skyline every few generations, burying something at a foundation level is not an irrational gesture. It might mark a beginning. It might protect a boundary. It might preserve an offering. It might declare that the visible structure above rests on an unseen relationship below. A more cautious explanation could be that many such deposits are exactly what they look like, ritual dedications with no hidden science fiction twist at all. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, another thought appears in the lamplight. What if one deep chamber, one sealed space, one carefully layered pocket beneath a sacred floor was meant to hold not wealth, but memory in physical form, not a crown, not a blade, not a glowing mystery object that conveniently survives in perfect condition for your documentary reenactment. Maybe something quieter, something organic, symbolic, or culturally loaded enough to be described in sacred language later on. The evidence we do have does not let us leap. It does, however, allow us to lean in. So you linger there in the cool under-temple dark, listening to the soft scrape of imagined tools and the hush of old brick settling under centuries of weight, and you keep one hand on the wall as if the wall might answer back. Above you the temple rises in phases. Below you layers wait. And somewhere between documented foundation practice and later mythic interpretation, a small possibility is planted. You keep your hand on the wall a little longer, letting the cool brick steady the imagination, and then your attention shifts from the buried space itself to the people who might have written about it in the least dramatic way possible. Because if there is one thing ancient administration does especially well, it is making a potentially fascinating event sound like a Tuesday. Most historians agree that cuneiform tablets preserve an astonishing range of records from Mesopotamia, including receipts, ration lists, labour assignments, contracts, temple accounts, hymns, myths, school exercises and letters. Archaeology suggests many of these tablets survived only because clay once dried or accidentally fired can outlast wood leather and the patience of anyone trying to carry too many crates at once. You can almost hear the archive room sighing under the weight of it all. And that is where the mood changes just slightly. You imagine a storage room of a temple complex, shelves or baskets, holding tablets, some newly written and damp, others hardened and older, each one small enough to fit in your hand, annoying enough to lose if you set it down near the wrong basket. A scribe sits cross-legged stylus, moving in quick wedge marks, recording quantities with the same energy modern people use to answer email at 11:47 p.m. It is not glamorous, but it is civilization in its work clothes. What's broadly accepted is that these records often track movement. Items come in, items go out, grain is measured, oil is issued, wool is counted, workers receive rations, offerings are noted, deliveries are transferred from one room, official or institution to another. The evidence we do have points to a world where writing is deeply tied to logistics, and that matters tonight because a phrase that sounds mysterious in a modern retelling may have originated in a very ordinary line of accounting. One interpretation is that a few tablet entries, especially fragmentary or context-poor ones, might describe transfers to locations below floor level into foundation spaces, sealed rooms or subterranean storage areas connected to ritual or protection. A careful reading might suggest that when an item is placed deposited or set below the action, could be practical, ceremonial, or both. That is already more interesting than a simple warehouse note, but still far from a hidden truth reveal. To be clear, this is debated. Historians still argue whether certain ambiguous administrative phrases in damaged cuneiform records should be read as routine storage instructions, ritual, deposit, language, or context-specific terminology that does not map neatly onto modern categories at all. And this is exactly why the puzzle remains such a good bedtime mystery. The text can be real. The ambiguity can be real. The dramatic leap can still be optional. You picture a tablet in your palm, edges chipped a line missing near the middle, one sign rubbed just enough to turn confidence into caution. A modern translator leans over a copy, compares parallels, checks sign lists, and probably drinks coffee strong enough to revive a ziggurat. The evidence we do have points to impressive scholarship, yes, but also to limits. Sometimes a sign is broken. Sometimes the tablet is out of archaeological context. Sometimes the line is technically readable and still not fully understandable because the administrative shorthand made perfect sense to the original scribe and almost no sense to anyone else 3,000 or 4,000 years later, which is honestly very on brand for office paperwork. A fringe idea proposes that dull transfer tablets are coded references to advanced underground installations left by divine beings, and a popular rumour claims the Anunnaki were quietly moving strange materials beneath temple foundations. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it keeps circulating because it borrows the credibility of real tablets and the thrill of missing context. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the better question becomes less flashy and more useful. What kinds of things did temple systems actually move and protect? And why might some of them go below ground? That question keeps your feet on solid brick. Most historians agree that temple economies handled valuable and vulnerable goods, including grain products, oils, textiles, and ritual items. Archaeology suggests storage strategies were shaped by climate pests, moisture, social control, and institutional habit. A more cautious explanation could be that references to below-ground placement simply describe safe, cool, sealed storage in a built environment where temperature and protection mattered. No glowing chamber required. No dramatic soundtrack necessary. The clay tablet itself is dramatic enough if you let it be. Still, the imagination leans in when words like planted, buried, placed, or set deep are involved. What if the dullest inventory note is the one that hums the loudest in the dark? Not because it proves anything. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Not because it confirms a sensational claim, but because it raises the possibility that a practical transfer and a symbolic act could happen at the same time. A temple official may move an item into a foundation-adjacent space for preservation, while a priestly ritual frames that movement as dedication. To us, those might seem like separate categories. To them, they may have overlapped as naturally as bread and beer at a work ration table. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented scribes tracked transfers in precise ways that can still be studied. Documented temples functioned as administrative engines in Sumerian city life. Interpreted a few references to unusual placement could suggest activities beneath standard floor level. Imagined, you can see a scribe pausing before writing the final line, stylus hovering, while workers in the next courtyard lift a sealed jar or wrapped bundle and disappear down a short stair into cooler air. The room itself stays quiet in your mind. The fan hum from your own space blends with the imagined hum of distant temple labour. You can almost feel the difference in temperature as a door opens to a lower chamber, above sunlight on plaster, below packed earth and brick, dim and patient. A small sound of clay touching clay, a seal pressed shut, a notation made. And maybe that is the real hook of the old stories. Not giant proclamations, but tiny administrative traces that suggest motion into the unseen. Archaeology suggests ancient archives were often scattered, broken and reshuffled by time, excavation history, and later damage, so any single tablet line should be handled gently. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Yet the mist is still part of the landscape, and tonight it curls around a simple possibility. Somewhere in the tablet world of transfers and tallies, the language of ordinary record keeping may have brushed against an act remembered later in sacred terms. You stay with that image for a moment longer, the scribe scratching wedges into clay, while the workers step downward with something carefully counted, carefully sealed, and carefully hidden from weather pests and chance. No trumpets, no beam of light, just a line in a ledger and a door closing softly below the temple floor. The soft closing of that imagined door below the temple floor lingers in your ears, and from there your thoughts naturally rise back into the world above it, where gods, fields, canals and city life are all tied together so tightly that separating religion from agriculture starts to feel like trying to separate bread from flour after it is baked. You can try, but the loaf is already the loaf. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion was deeply entangled with land fertility, seasonal cycles, and the authority of kings and temple institutions. What's broadly accepted is that the divine world was not distant in the way many modern people imagine. It was woven into irrigation harvests, storms' boundaries, and the fragile hope that next season's grain would actually come up where you planted it. Archaeology suggests temple economies and agricultural systems developed side by side, with religious centres playing visible roles in managing labour storage and offerings tied to the productivity of the land. So when you hear the name Anunnaki in modern retellings, it helps to slow down and dim the theatrical lighting just a little. Most historians agree that in Mesopotamian texts, the Anunnaki are divine beings appearing in mythic ritual and literary contexts with roles that shift depending on period and genre. They are not a single tidy cast with a fixed job description and matching badges. A careful reading might suggest that later popular interpretations flatten that complexity into a simpler story than the original material can support. That does not mean the mystery disappears. It means the mystery becomes more interesting and less cartoonish. Because once you place the Anunnaki back into a world concerned with sacred order, cultivated land, and stored abundance, the phrase planted deep underground starts to sound different. One interpretation is that language surrounding divine action and sacred placement may preserve memory of stewardship practices, ritual dedications, or preservation acts that later listeners recast in more dramatic terms. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But it is a useful possibility because it fits the texture of the world. In a civilization where grain can mean survival, where date palms are wealth and continuity, and where temples oversee both ritual and resources, planting is never just planting. It can be practical. It can be symbolic. It can be both at the same time, which is the Mesopotamian specialty. You walk in your mind through a temple courtyard at first light. Workers carry baskets. A priestly singer murmurs a hymn. Someone is checking jars. Someone else is checking the person checking jars, which means bureaucracy is thriving. You pass a wall niche with offerings and step toward a side room where seeds, oils, or ritual goods might be stored under official oversight. The room smells faintly of clay, straw, old wood, and bitumen. It feels less like a fantasy vault and more like the beating, practical heart of a city trying to outlast drought, flood, and bad luck. Archaeology suggests Sumerian cities invested heavily in managing water and agricultural production. And the evidence we do have points to environments that required constant maintenance and planning. The rivers gave life, but not politely. Flooding could help and harm. Soil could produce and then decline under long-term stress. A more cautious explanation could be that any deep planting remembered in later language reflected a response to ecological uncertainty rather than a supernatural secret. And yet the symbolic layer still matters. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if a divine narrative about beings who plant something below the surface is in part the sacred language of preservation, a way of saying that life itself must be protected in darkness before it can return in light? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the image becomes almost tender. Not aliens hiding gadgets. Not a treasure chest waiting for modern YouTube thumbnails. More like a temple culture placing future growth into cool earth, then wrapping the act in cosmic meaning, because survival for them was cosmic meaning. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented religion and agriculture in Sumerian life were deeply linked. Documented divine beings, such as the Anunnaki, appear in Mesopotamian textual traditions. Interpreted a phrase about planting below ground could carry ritual and preservation meanings. Imagined, you can picture a small group in a lamplit chamber lowering a sealed vessel into a prepared niche, speaking words that bless not just the object, but the city's next season. Historians still argue whether specific divine names and actions in later read Mesopotamian passages should be read as literal ritual references, poetic cosmology, or layered theological language shaped by scribal tradition. That debate can sound technical, but it changes the mood of the whole story. If a line is poetic, then planting may be metaphor. If a line is administrative, it may be storage. If a line reflects ritual action, it may be both practical placement and symbolic dedication. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And the wisest way forward is not to force one answer, where the ancient text might be holding several tones at once. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literally preserving non-human materials deep underground for a return in some distant age. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it borrows just enough imagery from real sacred and agricultural practice to keep sounding plausible to listeners who only hear the exciting version. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The exciting version is not always false because it is exciting. It is just often incomplete because it rushes past context. Context is where the old world breathes, and in that context, gardens matter, reeds matter, date palms matter, barley matters, canal silt matters, temple walls matter, the person tallying jars matters, the person carrying the jar down a stair matters. If the Anunnaki are invoked in a story about what was planted below one cautious reading, is that divine language may be framing an act of stewardship that was precious enough to remember and sacred enough to ritualize. You keep moving through the courtyard in your imagination, hearing distant birds near canal water sandals on packed earth, and the soft clink of a seal being set aside. The sun warms the upper bricks, but below coolness waits. Above ground is growth and exposure. Below ground is pause and protection. It is possible that this contrast, so physical and so familiar, helped shape the way stories were told. And if so, then the deep underground planting in the tale may not be about hiding from history at all. It may be about carrying history through a season when the surface could not be trusted. If the surface could not be trusted for a season, then what you protect and how you protect it become the whole story, and your mind settles on the most ordinary miracle in the ancient world, a seed that looks like almost nothing until it becomes bread, shade, fibre, beer fodder, and another year of not falling apart. Civilization has many grand monuments, but it also has tiny kernels doing all the heavy lifting. Most historians agree that Sumerian agriculture depended on careful management of crops and water in a demanding environment, and archaeology suggests barley was especially important in southern Mesopotamia. What's broadly accepted is that barley could tolerate conditions that made it a practical staple, while date palms, reeds, and other cultivated resources shaped daily life, construction, craft, production, and diet in ways that were both economic and symbolic. The evidence we do have points to a society that understood storage not as a boring afterthought, but a survival strategy. You can feel that truth in your hands if you imagine lifting a small clay jar and hearing the dry whisper inside. A more cautious explanation could be that stories or phrases about things being planted deep underground refer, at least in some cases, to hidden seed caches or protected reserves connected to temple management. That is not a flashy answer, but it is a strong one. Temples handled resources. Seeds are resources. Seeds are also future time in physical form. Put that combination into a sacred institution, and suddenly a practical storage act starts glowing with ritual significance without needing any science fiction machinery at all. Archaeology suggests ancient storage methods varied by material location and purpose, and while the details of every Sumerian seed preservation practice are not fully recoverable, the larger logic is easy to understand. Heat, dampness, pests, theft and accident are the enemies. Coolness, sealing oversight and stable spaces are your allies. If a chamber below floor level offers better protection, it may become the obvious place to keep what matters most. Sometimes the ancient world is mysterious. Sometimes it is just deeply sensible. And then, because this is Mesopotamia, sensibility and symbolism hold hands. One interpretation is that hidden seed reserves under or near temple spaces might have been framed ritually to align agricultural continuity with divine favour. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But even with that caution, the idea fits the world you have been walking through in your imagination. A temple is not merely a prayer site. It is a civic heart. The gods are linked to abundance. The fields depend on timing and water. The people depend on the fields. A sealed cache is both management and hope. Historians still argue whether certain references to buried or protected goods in Mesopotamian temple contexts should be understood as routine reserve storage, ceremonial deposits, or hybrid practices that move between sacred and practical categories. That hybrid possibility keeps tugging at your sleeve. You picture a temple official checking a list on damp clay while workers bring in sacks or jars. Not all of it is for immediate use. Some is counted, some distributed, some dedicated, some set aside. There is a difference between what feeds today and what protects tomorrow. Somewhere in the process, a small allotment may be selected with unusual care. Cleaner grain, better seed quality, special sealing, restricted access. Maybe not because it is magical, but because everyone understands the stakes. A failed planting season is not an inconvenience. It is a long, slow crisis. You probably won't survive this if you treat ancient grain storage like a side detail, because grain storage is the plot. Kings' temples, taxes, labour, rituals, canals, calendars, all of it bends back toward the same quiet reality. People need food, and future food begins as something dry and fragile, held in a container that can be lost, spoiled or saved. A fringe idea proposes that the planted underground motif preserves memory of exotic biological material given by the Anunnaki hidden beneath temple complexes for later recovery. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it stays alive because it attaches itself to a real and emotionally powerful image, guardians of civilization protecting life beneath the earth. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more grounded version may be just as compelling. Perhaps what was protected really was life in dormant form, only not in the sensational way rumour prefers. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the underground planting was remembered because the act itself sat at the intersection of agriculture, temple authority, and existential uncertainty? A careful reading might suggest that later listeners hearing divine names and buried placement language together expanded the mystery beyond the practical event that inspired it. That does not make the practical event small. It makes it human, which is often more haunting. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented Sumerian communities depended on managed agriculture, especially staple crops like barley. Documented temples played economic roles connected to storage and distribution. Interpreted hidden reserves in protected spaces may have carried both practical and sacred significance. Imagined you can kneel in a cool room below thick brickwork, while a priest presses a seal into wet clay over a jar lid, then pauses for a breath, as if listening for the city above. And the city above is always there in the background of these scenes. Donkeys shifting in a lane, reeds rustling near canal edges, a child laughing somewhere in a courtyard, someone complaining about measurements, someone else pretending they did not hear. The old world is not silent except in ruins. It is noisy, warm, organised, messy, and deeply aware that tomorrow depends on what is protected today. So when the modern phrase says the Anunnaki planted something deep underground, the calmest way to hold it is not as a solved revelation, but as a layered possibility. Most historians agree that divine and administrative language in Mesopotamian culture can overlap in ways that resist modern categories. Archaeology suggests protected storage and sacred architecture often shared practical space. One interpretation is that a hidden seed reserve temple cache or ritualized preservation act may sit somewhere behind the story. And if that is even partly true, then the buried thing is not just an object, it is a promise sealed in clay waiting for the season when the surface can be trusted again. A promise sealed in clay is a good way to think about it, and from there, your attention moves from seed and storage back to the architecture itself, to the strange tenderness ancient builders sometimes showed toward foundations, as if the first hidden layer of a building deserved a private conversation before the walls rose and the public rituals began. Most historians agree that foundation deposits were a real and widespread practice in many ancient Near Eastern building traditions, including Mesopotamian contexts, even though the exact forms and meanings varied by place and period. Archaeology suggests these deposits could include figurines inscribed, objects, tools, pegs, plaques, miniature items or symbolic materials intentionally placed in or beneath foundations during construction or restoration. What's broadly accepted is that such acts were not random trash disposal. They were deliberate. And deliberate hidden actions always catch the imagination. You picture masons working at ground level before the floor is finished. The foundation trench open, sun-high dust rising. Nearby a temple official or ritual specialist unwraps a small bundle. Maybe it contains a figurine, maybe a peg, maybe a plaque with an inscription naming a ruler, a deity or a dedication formula. Maybe something less obvious. The workers wait. The object is lowered. Earth closes over it. Brick follows. In an hour, the visible structure continues, but beneath it a message remains. One interpretation is that foundation deposits functioned not only as offerings to gods or protective gestures for buildings, but also as acts of memory aimed across time. A careful reading might suggest they were speaking to future rebuilders as much as to divine powers, saying in effect, this place mattered, this was built with intention, remember who set this line of bricks. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it helps explain why hidden objects and inscriptions can feel uncannily personal when they resurface centuries later. Historians still argue whether foundation deposits in specific Mesopotamian contexts should be understood primarily as magical protection, royal self-commemoration, liturgical dedication, or practical markers of rebuilding phases. It is probably all of those in different combinations, which is not as neat as a single answer, but much closer to how human rituals usually work. A king may want divine favour and future recognition. A priest may emphasise sacred protection. A builder may care that the corners are marked correctly. A scribe may just want the inscription to be legible before somebody smudges it with wet clay hands. Institutions are complicated. Ancient institutions were complicated in cuneiform. Archaeology suggests that hidden building deposits often appear in meaningful locations such as corners, thresholds, or foundation lines, and the evidence we do have points to patterned placement rather than casual burial. That pattern matters for tonight's question because it gives a mainstream framework for understanding why something intentionally planted underground near a sacred structure would not automatically imply a hidden machine, forbidden artifact, or cosmic secret. A more cautious explanation could be that the act belongs to the old grammar of construction ritual. Still, the cinematic mood sneaks in because hidden things beneath sacred floors always sound like they know more than they are saying. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if in one remembered or retold case, a buried object under a temple was less a gift to the gods and more a note to survivors? Not a note, in modern language of course, and not necessarily a literal written warning. Let me rephrase that more carefully. A foundation deposit or a bundle placed in a deep, prepared cavity might serve as a message in material form. We anticipated danger, we preserved this for continuity, rebuild from here. This raises the possibility that practical resilience and ritual symbolism were fused in a single hidden act. That idea is suggestive, not conclusive. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented Mesopotamian builders and rulers used foundation deposits and inscriptions in connection with major structures. Documented sacred architecture was rebuilt over time, creating layered sites where hidden objects could remain sealed beneath later floors. Interpreted, some deposits may have carried future-facing meaning beyond immediate ritual dedication. Imagined, you can watch a small object wrapped in cloth and bitumen-coated lining settle into a niche while the people present speak softly. Not because they are frightened, but because the moment feels weighty. A fringe idea proposes that these buried foundation objects were advanced devices left by the Anunnaki and disguised as ritual deposits. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it echoes a real feature of the archaeological record: intentional placement beneath monumental architecture, which is why it feels sticky in popular imagination. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask a better question. What kinds of ancient objects were considered important enough to hide at the beginning of a building's life? The answer pulls you back toward culture instead of spectacle. Identity markers, dedications, symbolic stand-ins, inscribed names, tiny crafted things with oversized meaning. People have always done this. Modern cities put time capsules in walls. Institutions bury commemorative objects. Families tuck letters into foundations and forget about them until a renovation surprises everyone and somebody suddenly starts crying in the kitchen. Human beings keep trying to whisper to the future through hidden materials. You can feel the continuity when you imagine the temple floor above that buried object, smooth and busy, years passing, then generations. Sandals crossing, offerings delivered, accounts recorded, repairs made, floods endured, regimes changed. The hidden thing remains not because it is supernatural, but because someone placed it where ordinary life would protect it by never seeing it again. Most historians agree that many foundation deposits were symbolic and ceremonial, not practical caches of food or tools. The evidence we do have points to variation, however, and that variation leaves room for mixed practices in specific settings. A careful reading might suggest that in a temple world where ritual administration and survival planning overlap, some buried placements could have done more than one job at once. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. So you stay with the image a little longer, the foundation trench, still open, the bundle, still in the official's hands, the heat above, and the cool earth below. And you notice how naturally the old story can support two truths at once. A hidden object can be a sacred dedication and a message. It can honour the gods and steady the future. It can be ordinary in material and extraordinary in intention. And if later traditions remembered that hidden beginning through divine names and dramatic language, the memory may have grown larger without losing the quiet human act at its centre. A hand lowering something meaningful into the ground before the first bricks close over it. The idea of a hidden message under a foundation lingers there with you, and it naturally pulls your imagination toward one of the oldest sacred places in southern Mesopotamia, Eridu, where the earth itself seems to remember being built, rebuilt, and built again until the layers start to feel less like architecture and more like a long conversation between generations. Most historians agree that Eridu was one of the earliest and most important sacred centres in southern Mesopotamia, and archaeology suggests the site preserves a deep sequence of temple rebuilding over very long spans of time. What's broadly accepted is that later Mesopotamian tradition treated Eridu as an ancient foundational place linked with divine order and the god Enki, while excavations revealed multiple superimposed temple levels beneath later construction. The evidence we do have points to a site where the ground under your feet is not just old, but densely historical. And that density changes how you hear a story about something planted deep underground. You picture Eridu not as a single frozen ruin, but as a living sacred mound across centuries. A modest earlier shrine becomes a larger one. Walls shift, floors rise, new bricks level old surfaces. Rituals continue while architecture changes around them. The people doing the work may not think in terms of ancient archaeology, of course. They think in terms of maintenance, restoration, honouring the god, preserving continuity, and making sure the sacred centre remains active. If they are tired, they probably also think about lunch. Archaeology suggests that at places like Eridu, rebuilding often created substantial stratified layers, which means earlier ritual acts, deposits, and construction choices could end up sealed beneath later phases. A careful reading might suggest that later stories about hidden things in very old sacred ground may preserve distant echoes of real practices, even if the details became blurred over time. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But Eridu is exactly the kind of place where memory and layer depth could fuse into legend. Historians still argue whether later Mesopotamian literary traditions about Eridu preserve accurate memory of very early cult practices, reshape theological symbolism, or a mix of both, filtered through centuries of scribal transmission. That debate matters because Eridu is powerful in two different ways at once. It is archaeologically important and it is narratively important. Most historians agree that those are not always the same thing. A site can be ancient in the ground and also become even more ancient in cultural imagination. Once a place becomes the old sacred place, stories stick to it like bitumen on brick. So when a modern retelling says the Anunnaki planted something deep underground, Eridu becomes a natural magnet for that idea, even if the actual evidence remains fragmentary and debated. A fringe idea proposes that the deepest levels at Eridu concealed an intentional living archive left by divine beings for a future age. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it borrows its mood from something real: the extraordinary depth and continuity of sacred rebuilding at one of the oldest cult centres in the region. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the grounded version becomes quietly compelling. What if the deepest level held not riches but a carefully chosen living sample? Let me rephrase that more carefully. Not necessarily one dramatic object waiting for modern discovery, but perhaps a remembered pattern of ritualized preservation in which selected materials associated with life, fertility, continuity, or sacred order were placed below ground during rebuilding phases. The evidence is not strong enough to declare this for any specific Anunnaki claim. And if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Still, Eridu's layered temple history makes the possibility feel culturally coherent. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented Eridu was an early major sacred centre, with long temple sequences and rebuilding layers. Documented Mesopotamian sacred architecture often involved continuity through rebuilding rather than clean replacement. Interpreted memories of buried rites or concealed placements could survive in altered form through later traditions. Imagined, you can stand at a half-finished rebuild while a small group kneels at an older level exposed by construction, deciding what must be placed back into the earth before the new floor closes. The sensory details come easily because Eridu invites them. The dry heat on upper brick, the cooler breath rising from a cut trench, the smell of dampened clay where workers prepare mortar, reeds stacked nearby, a line of baskets, someone brushing dust from an older wall face with surprising gentleness, as if touching the shoulder of an ancestor. The old level is not just rubble to them, it is charged ground. A more cautious explanation could be that many buried materials in such contexts were entirely standard ritual deposits with no seed vault or survival cache function at all. That is an important anchor. Most historians agree that we should not reverse engineer a grand hidden narrative from every deep layer at a sacred site. But the reverse mistake is possible too, treating all ritual placement as empty symbolism, when ancient communities may have seen ritual and practical continuity as inseparable. That is where Eridu keeps pulling the story inward. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not a secret technology chamber, not an underground laboratory with excellent branding, but a sacred memory of preservation repeated enough times in rebuilding practice that later tellings attach divine names and cosmic language to it. A careful reading might suggest that planted below in a temple world, linked to Enki and deep waters, could evoke protection, dormancy and renewal more than concealment for concealment's sake. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You linger on the image of a chosen item, maybe organic, maybe symbolic, maybe both, held over an old level at Eridu, while the new phase waits above. Voices lower, a seal is pressed, clay closes, the builders continue, centuries pass, later scribes inherit stories, modern readers inherit fragments, and somewhere between the deepest brick lines and the latest retelling, the idea survives that something precious was planted in the earth, not to vanish forever, but to endure in the cool dark until another generation needed the memory. The thought of clay closing over a chosen object at Eridu stays with you as the scene shifts from the physical trench to the language people use when they talk about going down, because in Mesopotamian, storytelling and ritual imagination descent is rarely just a direction. It can be a movement into danger, secrecy judgment, storage, transition memory, or all of those at once, depending on the text and the moment. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths and ritual literature make frequent use of vertical imagery, including journeys upward and downward gates, thresholds, hidden chambers and underworld spaces. Archaeology suggests underground or enclosed architectural spaces also mattered in practical life, from storage areas to foundation zones to built rooms with restricted access. What's broadly accepted is that the ancient imagination did not float free of architecture. People described the unseen using spaces they knew. That matters tonight because once you hear planted deep underground, the old descent language starts to glow around the phrase. You can feel it in your body even now listening in the dark. The small shift in pressure when you step down a stair, the cooler air, the slight echo change, the way your voice becomes softer without anyone telling you to whisper. Ancient people knew those sensations too. They built with sun-baked brick and clay plaster, but they also built experiences, thresholds, where light, temperature, sound and access all changed at once. One interpretation is that descent language in myths may sometimes echo real architectural experiences, including temple substructures, storage rooms, crypt-like spaces or ceremonial zones beneath or within monumental complexes. A careful reading might suggest that when later texts describe hiddenness, lowering ceiling or guarded passage, some imagery could be shaped by ordinary built environments as much as by pure cosmic fantasy. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it does not reduce myth to plumbing diagrams. It simply gives the imagination a local address. Historians still argue whether underworld and descent imagery in Mesopotamian literature primarily reflects theological cosmology ritual, performance language, lived architectural experience, or a layered blend of all three. And layered blend is a strong candidate here because Mesopotamian culture is very good at blending. Administrative language blends with ritual. Sacred space blends with storage utility. Mythic names blend with civic institutions. So if a tradition remembers the Anunnaki in connection with something placed below it, may be drawing from more than one register at once, literary, ritual, architectural and practical. A fringe idea proposes that descent scenes in Mesopotamian myth are encrypted descriptions of underground facilities built by non-human beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the imagery is vivid and the vocabulary of gates, depths and hidden places sounds irresistible to modern ears. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a more grounded explanation could be that ancient storytellers reuse familiar sensory experiences of enclosed and restricted spaces to communicate sacred meanings. That grounded explanation is not less atmospheric. It is, if anything, more so. You imagine a temple attendant carrying a sealed container down a short staircase lit by lamps set in wall niches. Above the courtyard is loud with work and sunlight. Below the room is cooler and quieter, the floor packed hard, the walls smelling faintly of plaster and bitumen. The act is practical, the mood is ritual. A scribe later writes about what was done, and over generations the memory may drift toward literary language of descent and hiddenness, because that is the emotional truth of the experience. You go down to protect what must endure. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the deep underground planting attached to the Anunnaki survives? Not because it records a literal spectacle, but because it captures a repeated pattern of sacred descent. An object lowered into cool darkness, a chamber sealed, a threshold crossed and a community above, continuing on while something important waits below. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm sometimes leaves behind very durable images. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented Mesopotamian myths use descent and threshold imagery in complex ways. Documented ancient built environments included enclosed and restricted spaces that shaped bodily experience. Interpreted literary descent motifs may at times echo real architectural practices or spaces, Imagined you can stand at the top of a narrow stair while a lamp flame bends in a draught and hear sandals descending one level below your sightline, followed by the soft scrape of a jar set down on earth. Most historians agree that mythic texts should not be read as straightforward engineering manuals, and that is a healthy boundary. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is possible for a myth to preserve echoes of lived practice without turning into a secret blueprint. The old stories are often more poetic and more practical than modern categories allow. They can carry cosmology and memory in the same sentence. You probably won't survive this if you demand every ancient verb choose one lane and stay there. A word can suggest ritual action, physical movement, and symbolic meaning all at once, especially in a culture where temple life, agriculture, and divine order overlap so completely. Archaeology suggests context is everything, and context is exactly what fragmentary stories love to withhold. So you listen for small motifs instead. The door closing, the cooler air, the lowered voices, the sealed container, the repeated movement down and back up. These are not proof of anything dramatic. This raises the possibility that a very human ritual choreography, repeated over centuries, helped shape how later stories imagined the hidden work of gods. And if the Anunnaki become attached to that hidden work in literary or ritual memory, the attachment may tell you less about extraterrestrials and more about scale. Divine names make ordinary acts feel cosmic. Lowering a protected object into the earth becomes, in sacred language, an action of beings who govern fate, fertility, and order. The practical event remains small in motion, but enormous in meaning. So the stair remains in your mind as you move forward, one hand on the wall, again lamp smoke drifting upward, and below you a chamber you cannot fully see. Not because it is forbidden to know, but because ancient stories often leave just enough shadow to keep you listening. That half-seen chamber below the stair stays with you, and now the story narrows its focus again from the language of descent to the plain old craft of keeping things from going bad, because sometimes the deepest mystery in antiquity is just preservation done well enough that later generations mistake competence for magic. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian builders and craftspeople used bitumen clay sealing and other practical techniques to waterproof bind coat and protect materials in a wide range of contexts. Archaeology suggests bitumen was especially important in southern Mesopotamia, where it appears in construction boatwork and sealing practices, while clay stoppers, seal impressions and jar closures help secure stored goods. What's broadly accepted is that protection technology in the ancient world was not primitive guesswork. It was learned, repeated, and often very effective. You can almost smell it as soon as the imagined door opens. The room below is cool compared with the courtyard, and there is that particular scent, clay dust, damp, earth, lamp oil, and a dark resinous note from bitumen lining or repair. Jars sit against the wall. Some are sealed with clay caps. Some carry impressed marks from cylinder seals or stamp seals that identify ownership, contents, or authority. One worker checks a closure with his thumb. Another squints at a mark as if ancient compliance audits are alive and thriving. They are. A more cautious explanation could be that sealed jars below ground held seed stock grain reserves, oils, or ritual materials for emergency use or controlled access, and that later retellings wrapped this practical preservation in divine language. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it fits the texture of what archaeology suggests about storage, sealing, and institutional control. If you are trying to protect vulnerable material through heat, pests, moisture swings, and human temptation, cool darkness plus good sealing is not a mystery cult. It is common sense with paperwork. Still, common sense can become sacred if enough lives depend on it. One interpretation is that when temple communities placed carefully sealed containers in protected below-ground spaces, the act itself may have been ritualized not because the technique needed magic, but because the stakes invited ceremony. A careful reading might suggest that the gods planted it in later memory could be a theological way of speaking about institutional preservation under divine patronage. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The phrase may not describe literal divine hands, but a human act framed within a divine order. Historians still argue whether references to sealed and hidden goods in Mesopotamian textual and ritual contexts should be read as standard storage management, sacred deposit, practice or context, specific procedures that moved between both worlds. That ongoing debate is one of the healthiest parts of this whole puzzle because it keeps us from treating technology and ritual as opposites. In many ancient settings, the best preservation techniques were embedded in institutions that were also religious. The person sealing a jar may be performing a practical task and a sacred responsibility at the same time. You and your modern kitchen containers do not usually carry cosmic significance, although if you have ever found a forgotten leftovers box from 3 weeks ago, you may disagree. A fringe idea proposes that bitumen-coated containers and deeply sealed chambers in Mesopotamian sites were used to preserve unknown substances, given by the Anunnaki, perhaps biological or technological, for future retrieval. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it borrows its force from a real historical fact. Ancient Mesopotamians were very good at sealing and protecting materials. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the stronger insight may be that preservation technology itself can look mysterious when later audiences have lost the everyday context. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the Anunnaki planted something deep underground is a memory-shaped phrase for an old preservation system, one involving sealed jars, restricted chambers, cool subfloor conditions, and institutional ritual, all gradually translated into divine narrative because the procedure was too important to describe as mere storage. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Yet what we do know about sealing and protection already explains a surprising amount. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented bitumen and clay sealing were widely used in Mesopotamian material culture to protect and secure goods. Documented temple and administrative systems depended on controlled storage and verified transfers. Interpreted deeply sealed containers in protected spaces may have inspired or overlapped with sacred language of hidden placement. Imagined, you can watch a worker warm a bitumen patch, press it neatly along a jar seam, then hand the container to an official who lowers it into a recessed niche, while a lamp flame trembles in the cool air. Archaeology suggests sealing systems also serve social purposes, not just practical ones. A seal impression can mark authority, identity, accountability, and access. The evidence we do have points to a world in which a closed container is also a statement about trust. Who sealed it? Who may open it? Who should not? That matters because underground placement plus sealing does not simply hide contents from nature, it can hide them from people. In a temple economy, restricted access is part of order. Most historians agree that not every sealed container in ancient Mesopotamia held something dramatic, and that is worth repeating before the imagination gets too enthusiastic. Most held ordinary things by ancient standards anyway. Grains, oils, goods, records, maybe offerings, maybe ingredients. But ordinary things become dramatic under pressure, especially when they are what stand between a city and hunger, or between a ritual calendar and interruption. So you stay with the room a little longer. Jars in rows, clay caps drying, seal marks catching lamplight, bitumen dark against pale plaster, the upper city audible but distant, as if the building itself is helping protect concentration. No glowing relics, no humming devices, just skill caution, and a culture that knows how to put vulnerable life into a container and ask earth and architecture to keep watch. And if later stories remember that hidden care as something the Anunnaki did, then perhaps the divine language is not trying to deceive. Perhaps it is trying to honour a truth ancient people felt deeply, that preservation done properly can feel like receiving help from the gods. That sense of hidden care jars sealed well enough to outlast heat and interruption naturally widens into a larger question. What kind of world makes a community invest so much attention in preserving things below ground in the first place? And the answer, as usual, is not romance. It is risk. Most historians agree that Sumerian city life unfolded in environments shaped by both opportunity and recurring strain, including flooding, shifting river courses, salinization problems in irrigated fields, and political competition between city-states. Archaeology suggests long-term agricultural management in southern Mesopotamia required constant adjustment, while textual evidence points to administrations deeply concerned with rations, labour, land, and stability. What's broadly accepted is that these were sophisticated urban societies, but sophistication does not cancel vulnerability. It usually reveals it. You can feel the practical anxiety under the grandeur. A temple courtyard may look steady from above. Brick walls, processions, accounts, offerings, officials moving with practiced authority, but every institution in that courtyard is quietly negotiating uncertainty. Will the canal flow properly this season? Will the levee hold? Will the grain yield drop? Will a rival city interfere with trade? Will labourers arrive? Will someone miscount rations? Will the gods be thanked correctly because no one wants to be the official remembered for skipping the ritual and then getting blamed for a flood? A more cautious explanation could be that any remembered command to place or plant something deep underground reflects ancient resilience, planning, storing essential materials in safer conditions during periods of environmental or social instability. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it aligns with how real institutions behave under recurring risk. You build redundancy, you protect seed stock, you centralise oversight, you ritualise the process so people take it seriously. You make the act feel larger than one administrator's opinion, because survival should not depend on whether someone is having an off day. One interpretation is that temple archives and later retellings may preserve these resilience practices in sacred language, especially when institutions tie divine order to agricultural continuity. A careful reading might suggest that the gods planted below could be theological shorthand for a community acting under divine mandate to preserve future growth through crisis. To be clear, this is debated. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive, but once you place the story inside the real pressures of Sumerian urban life, the idea stops sounding like fantasy and starts sounding like a memory of strategy. Historians still argue whether specific Mesopotamian narratives about divine intervention in times of crisis encode practical institutional responses, purely theological explanations, or literary patterns that only loosely reflect historical events. And honestly, it may depend on the text. The period and the scribal agenda. Some stories teach. Some legitimize rulers. Some ritualize fear. Some preserve cultural memory in mythic form. The old world is not a single voice. It is a chorus, and a few singers are definitely improvising. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki hid advanced materials underground because they foresaw a planet-wide catastrophe and needed a recovery kit for humanity. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it resonates because it mirrors something real ancient societies did live with recurring disaster risk and did develop strategies to reduce losses. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the less sensational version may still carry a profound image. Not gods burying machines, but communities burying continuity. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if a divine planting below the surface is really the remembered shape of disaster, planning a temple-sanctioned act of protecting seeds records, or ritual essentials in cool sealed places, while the visible world remained exposed to flood theft, war and bad harvests? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Yet what archaeology suggests about environmental stress and what texts show about institutional management already make this possibility worth sitting with. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented Sumerian cities faced environmental and political instability over long periods. Documented temple and palace systems managed resources, labour and storage under those pressures. Interpreted sacred language in some narratives may preserve institutional resilience practices in mythic form. Imagined, you can picture officials selecting a reserve in a tense season, voices quieter than usual, while dust blows across the courtyard, and workers carry sealed containers down into cool darkness before the storm line reaches the canals. Most historians agree that disaster preparedness in ancient societies did not look like modern emergency management manuals, but the underlying logic: preserve essentials, secure access, maintain authority, communicate seriousness, is deeply familiar. Archaeology suggests that when institutions survive repeated shocks, it is often because they develop habits of redundancy and protected storage. A temple chamber below ground, especially one with controlled access and durable ceiling, fits that logic almost too well. You probably won't survive this if you imagine ancient priests spending all day composing mysterious prophecies while ignoring inventory. The inventory is the prophecy in a way. A jar of viable seed secured before a bad season is a statement about the future. A sealed reserve under temple oversight says the city intends to continue. The act may be practical, but the meaning is enormous. And because the meaning is enormous, divine language arrives naturally. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian thought did not split religion and administration into separate boxes the way modern people often do. The evidence we do have points to institutions where cosmic order and civic order reinforced each other. So if an archive line ritual formula or later story attaches the Anunnaki to an underground planting, one careful reading is that divine authority is being used to authorize continuity through danger. That is not as flashy as a hidden alien vault, but it has something. The flashy version usually lacks a believable human motive. You stay with the image as the night deepens around you. The fan hum blending with imagined wind over reed beds. A temple wall holding coolness below and heat above. In the chamber, sealed containers wait. On the surface, officials continue the routines of order, because routine itself is a kind of shield. And somewhere in the old language, a phrase survives, half practical, half sacred, saying that something was planted beneath the earth so life could return when the season turned. The phrase survives, half practical and half sacred, and now the story brings you to one of the most quietly dramatic places in all of ancient studies, the translator's desk, where a single broken wedge can turn an underground planting from a storage note into a ritual act, or from a ritual act into a poetic metaphor, and no one gets to be fully comfortable about it. Most historians agree that reading cuneiform is a rigorous scholarly discipline shaped by sign values, grammar, genre, historical context, parallels and damage assessment, and archaeology suggests the material condition of tablets often complicates interpretation long before translation begins. What's broadly accepted is that many tablets are fragmentary, abraded, chipped, or incomplete. The evidence we do have points to extraordinary progress in decipherment and philology, but also to unavoidable uncertainty in specific passages, especially when the text is damaged or context poor. So yes, the mystery sometimes comes down to one tiny wedge. You picture a tablet laid under angled light. The surface is reddish-brown clay. The left edge is chipped. A line near the middle is compressed, where the scribe wrote quickly, or the clay shifted slightly. A sign that should be clear is softened by wear. Another sign looks plausible in two different ways, depending on whether you think the stroke is complete. A scholar compares hand copies, photographs, transliterations, lexical lists, and parallel texts, then pauses over a verb with the kind of concentration that can make an entire room go silent. A careful reading might suggest the verb means to place in a general sense. Another interpretation is that in context it could imply storing, depositing, setting down, or even something closer to planting, depending on object, syntax and genre. A more cautious explanation could be that modern retellings overtranslate a broad action verb into a dramatic phrase because planted, deep underground sounds irresistible. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is one scholars have to guard against in every ancient language, not just cuneiform. Historians still argue whether certain disputed verbs and damaged signs in Mesopotamian texts should be translated narrowly according to administrative parallels or more flexibly according to ritual and literary context. That argument may sound technical, but it changes everything. If the line is administrative, set below might simply describe storage movement. If it is ritual deposit, may be better than store. If it is literary, a metaphorical sense may be strongest. If the sign is damaged, all of those choices become provisional. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And sometimes what we can't confirm is one corner of one sign pressed by one scribe having a very normal workday 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. A fringe idea proposes that mainstream translators intentionally soften explosive meanings in Sumerian or Akkadian passages to hide references to advanced underground materials. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence we do have points instead to a far more ordinary reason for disagreement. Ancient texts are hard damaged and genre sensitive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the useful takeaway is not conspiracy, it is humility. Translation is interpretation under constraint. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Translation is not guessing, it is disciplined judgment, but disciplined judgment still involves choices when the evidence is partial. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented cuneiform translation depends heavily on context, genre, and tablet condition. Documented many passages remain debated because signs are damaged or terms are polyvalent. Interpreted a key verb in a story about underground placement might support multiple shades of meaning, such as bury, store, deposit, or plant. Imagined, you can see a scholar tracing a photograph with a pencil tip in the air, leaning back and deciding that one wedge mark is just too uncertain to justify a dramatic claim. Most historians agree that good translation practice favours caution over spectacle, especially when a reading would support an extraordinary conclusion. That does not mean extraordinary conclusions are impossible in principle. It means they need stronger support than a damaged line and a viral headline. Archaeology suggests context can rescue a translation or complicate it, and in many cases, the fine spot associated objects and parallel texts matter as much as the individual word itself. You probably won't survive this if you want ancient philology to behave like a movie reveal, where one genius spots the hidden code and everyone gasps on cue. Real scholarship is slower and somehow more suspenseful. One person proposes a reading, another compares parallels, a third points out a grammatical issue, a fourth says the sign form belongs to a later hand. Then everybody drinks tea or coffee and keeps arguing politely for 30 years. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the phrase planted deep underground is the modern after-image of a more ordinary but still meaningful term, one that originally described placing, depositing, or storing something in a protected lower space, and only later picked up the stronger aura of planting, because that word better captures the themes of life, dormancy and return. This raises the possibility that translation drift itself helped shape the mystery, not through deceit but through metaphor choosing the most evocative route. Archaeology suggests ancient record systems often combine formulaic language with local shorthand, and the evidence we do have points to scribes writing for their own institutions, not for modern readers. That means some verbs may have carried administrative nuances obvious to contemporaries and murky to us. Scholars continue to debate specific cases, and there's no full consensus on every phrase that modern retellings like to spotlight. So you linger at the desk a little longer, listening to paper turn lamp light, catch a tablet edge, and the small inward sigh that comes when a scholar decides to leave a word open rather than force certainty. It's a very undramatic sound, and maybe that is why it matters. The old story remains alive because careful people keep refusing to flatten it too quickly. A single wedge mark may not unlock a hidden truth, but it might support the idea that the original line had more than one honest reading, and in that ambiguity the underground chamber stays cool, the jar stays sealed, and the question keeps breathing. The question keeps breathing because translation is only one layer of the problem, and once you leave the scholar's desk, you find another quiet, trap-waiting genre. The simple fact that an ancient culture can use the same divine names in one kind of text and entirely different writing habits in another, while modern readers blend them together like they were all episodes from the same show. Most historians agree that the Anunnaki appear in Mesopotamian, literary and ritual traditions as divine beings, but the exact roles, associations and emphases vary across periods, languages and textual genres. What's broadly accepted is that mythic compositions, hymns, laments, ritual texts and administrative records do not speak with the same voice or purpose. Archaeology suggests the institutions producing these texts often overlapped in real life temple complexes, scribal schools, courtly settings, but overlap of institutions does not erase differences in genre. That distinction matters more than it first seems. You can imagine the scribal world as a series of rooms. In one room, a student copies lexical lists and signs until his wrist complains. In another, an administrator records grain allocations. In another, a ritual specialist preserves a liturgy. In another, a scribe copies a mythic composition invoking divine assemblies and cosmic order. The same culture, the same writing system, sometimes even the same broad institutions, but different purposes, tones and conventions. If you lift one phrase from each room and stack them without context, you can build almost any story you want. A careful reading might suggest that this is exactly how some modern Anunnaki narratives become so persuasive. A mythic reference provides scale, a ritual phrase provides atmosphere, an administrative line provides apparent concreteness. Then the three are fused into one seamless claim about what the texts reveal. That is a possibility, not a certainty in every retelling, but it is a common enough pattern to watch for. The evidence we do have points to a richer and messier reality. Historians still argue whether specific mentions of divine beings in certain Mesopotamian texts should be read as direct theological assertions, inherited literary formulas, ritual performance, language, or scribal conventional expressions with limited historical referential value. The argument sounds abstract until you place it beside tonight's central image. If an administrative tablet describes a sealed transfer to a lower space, that does not automatically mean the Anunnaki were personally involved. If a literary text describes the Anunnaki in a cosmic role, that does not automatically describe an actual storage event. One interpretation is that the enduring mystery comes from moments where these genres brush against each other in later memory, not necessarily in the original documents themselves. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the puzzle survives because two genres brush against each other, a practical record of hidden placement on one side, and divine language of order, fate, or sacred authority on the other, with later readers connecting them into a single dramatic thread? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We often cannot prove that a specific literary image and a specific administrative action refer to the same event. But we also cannot deny that ancient audiences lived in a world where practical and sacred systems overlapped constantly. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented, the Anunnaki belong primarily to mythic and ritual textual traditions, not modern pseudo-technical categories. Documented administrative tablets track practical movements of goods in highly formulaic ways. Interpreted later readers may over-connect these genres when reconstructing a hidden underground planting narrative. Imagined you can stand in a scribal school at dusk hearing one student recite divine names, while another scratches out a ration line nearby, the sounds blending in the hall even as the texts mean different things. A fringe idea proposes that the genre distinctions themselves are a smokescreen, and that all references to the Anunnaki, literary and administrative alike, belong to one hidden historical record. This theory isn't widely accepted, and archaeology suggests a much more ordinary explanation. Scribal cultures produce many text types for different functions. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the stronger insight may be that the old civilization's complexity is what creates the illusion of a single coded narrative. Complexity can feel like secrecy when you only see fragments. Most historians agree that careful interpretation requires staying alert to genre before making historical claims from isolated phrases. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Genre is not a wall that forbids connections. It is a filter that helps you judge what kind of connection is plausible. A ritual text may preserve social realities indirectly. An administrative record may sit inside a sacred institution. A literary image may echo built space. But none of these moves are automatic. Each one needs context. You probably won't survive this if you expect ancient texts to label themselves with neat modern tags like factual, symbolic, poetic, or bureaucratic in the margin. They do not. They just sit there in clay, looking calm, while scholars and storytellers do interpretive yoga around them. And yet the calm is useful. It slows you down enough to notice that the most compelling version of tonight's question may not depend on forcing all texts into one account. The phrase Anunnaki planted deep underground can function as a modern umbrella for several older strands, sacred language about divine authority, real institutional practices of hidden placement and preservation, and later storytelling that merges them because the merge feels meaningful. Archaeology suggests temple life was exactly the kind of environment where these strands could cross in practice, even if they remain distinct in writing. The evidence we do have points to a world in which divine names legitimize institutions. Institutions manage resources, and resources are sometimes placed in protected lower spaces. That is already enough to generate a durable mystery without inventing a secret master file. So the image that stays with you is not a single tablet revealing everything. It is a corridor with doors, myth on one side, accounting on the other, ritual somewhere farther down. And your task is not to knock all the walls down, but to listen carefully through each door before deciding whether the sounds belong to the same room. Listening through each door without kicking them all down turns out to be the perfect habit for the part of the story where the lamplight gets a little stranger, because this is where modern fringe theories gather point at the same old underground chamber and start speaking in a much louder voice than the evidence can comfortably support. Most historians agree that there is no mainstream archaeological consensus supporting extraterrestrial claims about the Anunnaki or hidden advanced technology in Sumerian temple contexts. Archaeology suggests the material record of Mesopotamia is rich, complex, and genuinely astonishing on its own terms, but the evidence we do have points to human-built institutions, human-managed storage, human ritual practices, and human writing traditions, rather than confirmed non-human intervention. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamia needs no sci-fi upgrade to be fascinating. Still, a fringe idea proposes exactly that. A fringe idea proposes that references to the Anunnaki planting something deep underground preserve a literal memory of non-human beings storing advanced biological or technological materials beneath Sumerian sacred sites. A popular rumour claims temple foundations and buried chambers were part of a planetary recovery system waiting to be reopened after catastrophe. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because it stitches together real ingredients, ancient texts, buried architecture, sealed containers, divine names, environmental crisis and translation ambiguity into one dramatic narrative with very little patience for genre or context. And to be fair, that recipe is powerful. It is like adding extra sugar to an already good dessert. You can do it. People will love it. But eventually, someone has to ask what the original ingredients tasted like. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the question becomes more interesting and less combative. Why do these theories keep forming around Mesopotamia specifically? One interpretation is that the Sumerian record offers an unusually potent mix of early urban complexity, fragmentary evidence, divine cosmology, and partially recoverable language, which invites both scholarship and projection. A careful reading might suggest that the gaps in the evidence are doing as much work as the evidence itself. Historians still argue whether the enduring popularity of Anunnaki fringe narratives reflects modern distrust of institutions, fascination with lost knowledge, misunderstanding of ancient genres, or simply the timeless appeal of a good cosmic mystery. Probably all of the above in changing proportions, depending on the listener and the decade. You can feel the pull yourself if you let the scene play in your mind. A sealed room, below a temple, a divine name, in a text, a damaged verb, a city under environmental stress, and a phrase that sounds like something was planted underground on purpose. That is excellent storytelling fuel. The problem begins when fuel is mistaken for proof. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The image may be evocative enough to inspire theories, but evocative is not the same as verified. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented Mesopotamian temple sites contain layered architecture deposits and evidence of controlled storage and ritual practice. Documented, the Anunnaki are divine figures in Mesopotamian textual traditions. Interpreted, some modern readers connect underground placement language with preservation crisis response or symbolic burial. Imagined, you can stand under a temple stair and feel why later audiences might fill the chamber with whatever their era fears or hopes most. Most historians agree that extraordinary claims require strong evidence, and the evidence we do have does not currently support a literal advanced tech Anunnaki cache beneath Sumerian temples. That sentence matters, but it does not have to flatten the wonder. A more cautious explanation could be that human communities built very sophisticated systems of symbolic and practical preservation, then described those systems within divine frameworks that later readers no longer intuitively understand. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real value of the fringe theory is not its conclusion, but its accidental question: why did ancient people place meaningful things below ground? And how did that act become wrapped in divine narrative? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And sometimes the best outcome is not solving the mystery with a grand claim, but learning to ask better questions while the chamber remains partly dark. You probably won't survive this if you expect me to tell you the ancient world is boring once we remove the aliens. The opposite happens. The human version gets stranger in quieter ways. A city-state survives by managing water and grain. Priests and administrators share spaces and responsibilities. Scribes preserve both myths and receipts. Builders hide symbolic objects in foundations. Translators wrestle with damaged signs. Later storytellers merge genres and motives. No glowing machine required. Just time, ritual, risk, and memory. Archaeology suggests the popular imagination often gravitates to binary choices, either hidden cosmic truth or dry academic dismissal. But the evidence we do have points to a middle path that is much more rewarding. This raises the possibility that the most meaningful reading of Anunnaki planted deep underground is neither literal extraterrestrial history nor empty metaphor, but a layered memory of preservation, sacred authority, and institutional resilience. That reading is suggestive, not conclusive. And maybe that is why the phrase keeps returning in the quiet hours when your guard is down and the fan hum starts to sound like distant wind over old mud brick. The chamber below the temple remains partly visible, partly imagined. The jars are sealed. The words are damaged. The divine names are powerful. The scholars are careful. The rumour is loud. You sit with all of it, and for once the uncertainty feels less like a failure and more like a proper ancient atmosphere. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues, and the clues are still worth following even when they lead us back to human hands. Human hands, not glowing machines. And once you accept that as the most stable ground beneath your feet, a new image comes into focus that is somehow more moving than the sensational one. The possibility that some of these protected below ground spaces functioned in memory, if not always by design, like seed vaults before seed vaults. Most historians agree that ancient societies developed storage systems to protect food seed and other essential goods against time spoilage and uncertainty. Archaeology suggests protected storage architecture appears in many forms across the ancient world, depending on climate, material, and institutional organisation. What's broadly accepted is that preserving future planting stock was a practical necessity long before anyone used modern language like resilience planning or seed security. The evidence we do have points to a very old human instinct: if tomorrow is fragile, guard the beginning of tomorrow. And the beginning of tomorrow often fits in a jar. A careful reading might suggest that temple substructures, sealed chambers, and controlled storage practices in Mesopotamian cities could in some cases have functioned as proto-vaults in local memory, even if they were not purpose-built seed vaults in the modern technical sense. That's a possibility, not a certainty. It is important not to project modern institutions backward too neatly. Still, the analogy is useful because it captures the emotional logic. You place something vital where heat theft and chaos are less likely to reach it, and you trust a social system to remember where and why it was hidden. Historians still argue whether references to protected goods in Mesopotamian temple and administrative context should be interpreted as emergency reserves, routine, seasonal storage, ritual deposits, or shifting combinations that changed over time and place. That debate keeps the picture honest, and it also makes the picture better. A modern seed vault sounds singular and technical. Ancient storage worlds were plural and layered. One chamber might hold reserve grain, another might hold offerings, another might contain sealed goods for controlled distribution. A foundation niche might hold symbolic objects. A temple archive might preserve records that tell you what was stored and who may access it. The old system is less a vault than a network, which is exactly how complex societies survive. One interpretation is that later storytelling condensed this network into a single memorable image, something precious planted deep underground by divine authority. A more cautious explanation could be that Anunnaki planted became a mythic umbrella over many practical acts of preservation performed by temple communities under sacred supervision. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, but the analogy still helps you feel the continuity across time. What if the stories are pointing at something else? What if the deep underground planting was remembered not because it was exotic, but because it was the most ordinary and sacred thing a city could do? Protect the means of renewal. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Yet what we do know about agriculture, temple administration, sealing practices, and environmental pressure makes this possibility feel deeply human, almost painfully so. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented ancient Mesopotamian institutions developed controlled storage and resource management systems. Documented seeds and grain reserves were central to survival in agricultural city-states. Interpreted, some below-ground protected placements may have functioned in ways analogous to proto-vault practices, at least in memory and social meaning. Imagined, you can watch a temple official choose from several jars, reject 2 nod at one, and mark it for deep storage because the city cannot afford a bad planting season, and no one says that sentence out loud. Most historians agree that modern analogies can mislead if taken too literally, and that is worth repeating here. A Sumerian subfloor chamber is not a direct equivalent of a modern engineered seed vault. Archaeology suggests differences in scale, design, and institutional context are enormous. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The comparison is a lens, not a label. It helps illuminate motive, preservation, continuity, and trust. It does not prove identical systems. A fringe idea proposes that these proto-vault spaces held genetically engineered stock from the Anunnaki preserved beneath temples for future reintroduction. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it parasitizes a real emotional truth. Societies do hide life-bearing materials for later recovery. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the stronger lesson may be simpler and older. Human communities facing uncertainty become inventive caretakers of dormancy. You probably won't survive this if you underestimate dormancy. Dormancy sounds sleepy, which is great for us right now, but in historical terms, it is one of civilization's superpowers. Seeds wait, archives wait, ritual formulas wait, foundation deposits wait. A city can fall, a wall can crack, a canal can shift, and still some things remain in the cool dark, long enough for another generation to begin again. Archaeology suggests the physical reality of buried and sealed materials often creates delayed meaning. Objects become more important because they endure beyond the context that created them. The evidence we do have points to this strange effect again and again. What begins as management can become memory. What begins as routine can become legend. What begins as a jar in a side chamber can become centuries later a story about divine beings planting something underground. And maybe local memory played a role too, the kind that never becomes a formal text, but survives in gestures, rebuilding customs, priestly phrases, and the stubborn sense that certain hidden places under old sacred floors are not to be disturbed casually because they are tied to continuity itself. Scholars continue to debate how far such memory can be traced, and there's no full consensus, but the possibility has a quiet dignity. So the chamber in your mind shifts once more. It is less secret vault, more entrusted pause, less dramatic reveal, more controlled waiting. A place where a community asks earth, brick, seal and institution to collaborate in keeping tomorrow alive. If later generations name that act with divine language and attach it to the Anunnaki, perhaps they are not inventing the value of the act. They are only magnifying it. That entrusted pause, a hidden place where tomorrow is asked to wait safely, is exactly the kind of image that survives across centuries, and it also explains why the final step before any conclusion has to be the least glamorous one of all, admitting how much of the ancient record is incomplete. Most historians agree that many Mesopotamian tablets survive in fragmentary condition, and that early excavations, especially by late 19th and early 20th century standards, were often documented less precisely than modern archaeology would require. Archaeology suggests this is not a scandal so much as a structural reality of the field. Countless objects were recovered under difficult conditions, recording methods, varied contexts were sometimes lost or generalized, and later collections dispersed materials across museums and archives. What's broadly accepted is that we know a great deal and we also lack a great deal. Both truths matter tonight. You can picture a tablet in a museum drawer with a catalogue number, a collection label, and a respectable amount of scholarly attention, and still not know exactly where in a building it was found, what lay beside it, or whether the line you care about is complete. You can picture an excavation notebook from a century ago, diligent in places, frustrating in others, and feel the historian's version of heartbreak, not a dramatic collapse, just a missing context line that would have changed everything. It is the archival equivalent of finding the perfect recipe with the oven temperature torn off. A more cautious explanation could be that some modern narratives about underground Anunnaki plantings become so confident because they smooth over these gaps in provenance, context, and textual completeness. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every case, but the pattern is familiar. Ambiguity is uncomfortable, and storytelling often rushes in to make the room feel warmer. The problem is not storytelling itself. The problem is forgetting which parts are documented and which parts are filling the silence. Historians still argue whether certain high-profile claims, built from fragmentary Mesopotamian evidence, rest on plausible synthesis, overextended interpretation, or modern myth-making layered onto genuinely unresolved data. That argument can sound severe, but it is really a form of care. Most historians agree that uncertainty should be stated plainly, not hidden in small print after a dramatic claim. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And in this story, there is mist. There are broken tablets. There are uncertain verbs. There are mixed genres. There are buried spaces without complete records. There are old excavations whose notes are useful and imperfect at the same time. One interpretation is that the persistence of the planted deep underground idea reflects how powerfully these gaps invite narrative stitching. A careful reading might suggest that listeners are not being irrational when they sense a pattern. They may be responding to real recurring elements, buried deposits, sealed goods, divine language, crisis, memory temple, substructures. But the pattern can remain real even when the strongest conclusion remains out of reach. Let me rephrase that more carefully. A pattern can be meaningful without being a solved code. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented many cuneiform tablets are fragmentary and require contextual reconstruction. Documented early excavation records are invaluable, but not always complete by modern standards. Interpreted later retellings may overstate certainty when linking scattered data into a single underground planting narrative. Imagined, you can sit at a long table with photographs, copies, catalogue slips, and site plans, while the most important answer hovers just out of frame, like a lamplit moth refusing to land. A fringe idea proposes that missing context and damaged records are themselves evidence of intentional suppression surrounding what the Anunnaki planted. This theory isn't widely accepted, and archaeology suggests a far simpler explanation. Ancient materials break excavations, our messy archives disperse, and scholarship proceeds unevenly across generations. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more useful lesson is not suspicion for its own sake. It is discipline. You do not cure uncertainty by pretending it is certainty in disguise. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the enduring power of this story comes from the honest edge where evidence stops and imagination begins, and from the rare chance to practice separating them without losing wonder? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. That sentence keeps returning, because it is not a warning to stop thinking. It is an invitation to think carefully. You probably won't survive this if you need the ancient world to hand over a perfect archive with colour-coded labels and a map to every chamber. It will not. It gives you fragments, layers, reused bricks, damaged lines, later copies, old excavation habits, and moments of startling clarity surrounded by silence. And somehow, from that, scholars reconstruct cities, economies, rituals, and languages with remarkable precision. The gaps are real, but so is the achievement. Archaeology suggests good interpretation often grows from restraint, not maximal claims. The evidence we do have points to a credible picture in which Sumerian temple worlds combined practical storage, ritual, deposition, sacred language, and institutional resilience in ways that could later be remembered as a dramatic underground planting associated with divine beings. That picture is broad enough to fit much of what we know and cautious enough to omit what we do not. So the chamber in your mind remains partially open, which may be the most historically faithful way to leave it. You can see the stair. You can smell the clay and bitumen. You can imagine the sealed jars and the lowered voices. You can hear the scribal stylus scratching in another room. You can feel how a later story might gather all of that into one phrase and hand it to the future like a polished mystery. And now, with the evidence's limits gently in view, you are ready to sit with the question one last time, not to force it shut, but to let it settle into something calmer and truer than a reveal. So you arrive at the last doorway with the chamber still partly open in your mind. And what waits here is not a final reveal in bright letters, but something quieter, a way of holding the whole puzzle without flattening it. The phrase that brought you down these temple stairs, Sumerian text, reveal what the Anunnaki planted deep underground, still has its grip. But now it feels different in your hands, less like a headline, and more like a layered object made of clay, memory, and cautious reading. Most historians agree that Sumerian and wider Mesopotamian civilizations created complex temple institutions where religion, administration, agriculture, and architecture were deeply intertwined. Archaeology suggests sacred sites accumulated layers through rebuilding, preserved hidden deposits, and used practical storage and sealing techniques that could protect important materials in cool controlled spaces. What's broadly accepted is that this world already contains everything needed for a powerful underground story without requiring a single modern fantasy element to make it compelling. One interpretation is that the deep underground planting motif may preserve a blended memory of ritual deposition, protected storage and resilience planning later retold in divine language that attach the act to beings like the Anunnaki. A careful reading might suggest that what sounds like a shocking secret could instead be a sacred way of describing preservation, especially in a culture where continuity itself was holy. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But it is a possibility with roots in the evidence, and roots are a nice thing to have in a story about planting. Historians still argue whether specific texts and phrases behind modern retellings point to ritual symbolism, administrative storage, literary metaphor, crisis memory, or some changing combination of all four. That debate is not a flaw in the story. It is the story behaving honestly. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki literally buried advanced non-human material beneath Sumerian temples for future recovery. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence we do have does not support that conclusion. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, however, it still helps expose the emotional centre of the mystery, the fear that something essential might be lost, and the hope that something essential can be hidden long enough to survive. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the last image worth keeping is not a secret device or cosmic cache, but a human act made sacred hands lowering a sealed vessel, or symbolic deposit into cool earth beneath a temple floor, trusting brick ritual and memory to guard the future. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And in this case, what we can't confirm has not left us empty, it has left us a shape. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented Mesopotamian temples managed resources and stood on layered architectural histories. Documented foundation deposits, sealed containers, and controlled storage practices existed in the world around these texts and sites. Interpreted underground placement language may sometimes reflect preservation acts, ritual dedications, or both. Imagined, you can still stand at that stair and feel the cooler air on your face, while a lamp trembles and a quiet group below finishes sealing tomorrow into darkness. Most historians agree that the ancient world is often stranger and more meaningful when we let it remain partly unresolved. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Resolution is satisfying, but proportion matters. When evidence is fragmentary, the wisest ending is not a forced certainty. It is a careful balance between confidence and wonder. The evidence we do have points to a civilization of remarkable practical intelligence and symbolic depth. This raises the possibility that the underground planting story endured because it carries both at once. You probably won't survive this if you came for only one kind of answer. If you wanted pure debunking, the old chamber may feel too alive. If you wanted pure revelation, the scholarship may feel too careful. But if you can live in the middle for a while, where clay tablets remain partial, temple floors remain layered, and divine names still cast a long shadow over grain jars and hidden rooms, then the story becomes exactly what a bedtime history should be, grounded enough to trust, mysterious enough to drift with. And now the pace softens. You let the temple walls grow less sharp in your imagination. The brick edges blur. The lamplight lowers. The seal marks on the jars catch one last glint, then fade into the kind of darkness that feels protective rather than empty. Above ground, the city is still there in the distance. Reed beds shifting near, canal water, sandals on packed earth, a door closing somewhere in a courtyard, someone finishing account before sleep. Below ground, the cool chamber keeps its patient silence. No one needs to force it open tonight. What's broadly accepted is enough to rest on. Archaeology suggests careful people built, stored, sealed, repaired, and remembered. The evidence we do have points to hands, tools, clay, bitumen grain, ritual words, and institutions trying to carry life through uncertainty. One interpretation is that the old phrase about the Anunnaki planting something deep underground is the echo of that effort enlarged by time, wrapped in sacred language, and handed forward because it felt too important to lose. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. If the story grows misty, we'll notice. If wonder arrives anyway, we can let it sit beside the facts without asking either one to become the other. So you breathe a little slower and the stare in your mind becomes just a cool line descending into earth. Not a threat, not a secret you failed to solve, only a reminder that ancient people also lived with uncertainty and answered it with care. They sealed what mattered. They trusted layers. They left traces. We read what remains. And somewhere in that long exchange between their caution and our curiosity, the chamber stays gently closed, holding not proof but possibility, until sleep takes the question and sets it down softly in the dark.